to this 420. My name is Marco Perduca. I was the chair of the promoting committee for the cannabis referendum in Italy. And I am also founder of Luca Coscioni Association. And together with other NGOs and groups, we have organized this meeting to remember 420. We have the Associazione Luca Coscioni, Meglio, Legale, Antigone, Forum Droghe, Società, della, Ragione, and then we have VOC from the Netherlands, EUmans, International Association, and Onda Verde, Fuori Logo, and Agenda Podcast, and CRAINN from Ireland. Today, cannabis is a cannabis day all over the world, or marijuana, or doesn't matter how you want to call it. It's a plant that in most UN member countries is still criminalized. It's illegal. So we want to find the best possible way to try and decriminalize it in order to have the possibility to use cannabis for personal use, or to have it legalized for social use in various ways without any criminal sanctions or convictions. We want to remember the use of cannabis rather than insist on changing the laws and rules about the substances contained in the 3 international conventions and cannabis in particular. So we decided to summon this meeting that we opened at 4:20 in this is CET time, and will end up at 7 o'clock at night, CET time, not only to have an overview about the rules and legislation about cannabis in the various countries, but also to try and promote initiatives at national, continental in Europe, and international level, to try and change the rules that since 1961, when the first convention on narcotics was introduced, some plants and their derivatives have been placed under legal control. But these plants were traditionally medicinal plants. I see that Marco Cappato is with us, is a former MEP, is the treasurer of Associazione Luca Coscioni, and is one of the promoters of the cannabis referendum in Italy. And we'll have, therefore, a session to give you an overview of what's going on in the EU member states and in Europe, and to try and see what are European institutions providing as an initiative by citizens in order to change policies. Then there will be a second session about the international level, and we will introduce a study that was recently published, starting from the conventions of 1961 that introduced this prohibition system, that have created this international control system for drugs, in order to see not only how to interpret conventions, because we know that there are different interpretations, and the Second General Assembly of the UN about drugs has already stated that. But we also want to understand and see what these rules do not cover. And we want also to examine some of the decisions made by the European Council 18 years ago. Then we will listen to about the law adopted by the Congress in the United States, because what has just started in the United States, and it's a positive move, might come to Europe. We will conclude with a debate with the participation of some member of Italian Parliament, and we thank them because they are going to vote about some justice issues this afternoon. So members of the Italian Parliament will take the floor. We know that in June there will be a plenary session to discuss a bill that could envisage some rules for the cultivation of 4 cannabis plants. And on the other hand, this new bill should also reduce the sanctions and the punishments for the use and possession of cannabis. Then there will be Virginia Fumo will explain the European Citizens Initiative, Leonardo Fiorentini, who is the Secretary General of Droghe, and then we will have, as I said, a representative of the Italian Parliament with Antonella Soldo. At the end of each session, it will be also possible to put questions, bearing in mind that a lot of people would like to take the floor, and we only have 2 hours and 40 minutes. So I'll leave the floor to Marco Cappato for a short introduction, and then we will open the debate. The floor to you, Marco.
Marco, ti vediamo, ma non ti sentiamo. Pronto, pronto, eccoti. Sei un po' sottosopra, ma... Marco? Ci sei? Stiamo aspettando che Marco Cappato si possa connettere. Ecco.
We are waiting for Marco Cappato to join us. We can see his face, but we do not hear his voice. He is still mute. In the meantime, please keep sharing this stream. Can you hear me now? Yes, we can. Well, I have a difficult connection for some reason, but as we said, we won't give up because of the decision of the Constitutional Court to prevent the will of the Italian people to be heard about the legalization of cannabis. And we shall submit an appeal against the decision because there has been a mistake, a practical mistake in the decision. You heard that. Now I'm in the right position. Well, you heard that in Giuliano Amato's words, that the president of the Constitutional Court, he said that there was a material mistake in the way in which the question about the referendum question had been posed. And so this urban legend spread out about the fact that the question was ill-worded, but that wasn't true. That was a a misinterpretation on the part of the Constitutional Court, and vice versa. I believe the court made a mistake by accusing the referendum organizing committee of having done what they actually did. That is to say, they refer to the wrong acts of law, wrong rules concerning the application and the admissibility of the referendum. So we believe there is a space for an appeal, and we'll ask that the Constitutional Court expresses their opinion again. Of course, there is also case law from the Italian Constitutional Court, and this case law has been created over decades, and it has made it impossible for us to make the referendum procedures certain. It's now very difficult to launch referendums that are sure to be approved by the Constitutional Court. So we'll file an appeal against the decision of the Constitutional Court about this referendum, the one of the legalization of cannabis. But here also on behalf of the Luca Coscioni Association, and not just my personal position, will also file an appeal asking for a reform of the law on referendum and on the powers of the Constitutional Court, because it is obvious that the Constitutional Court is now using powers that they don't have. The Constitution clearly states what are the matters, the topics about which a referendum cannot be organized, but the Constitutional Court is now using discretionary power to question the topic, the matter of the referendums themselves. And so about this, we will submit proposals for reform, and if necessary, we'll do that through a citizens' initiative. Thank you for organizing this day. It's not just a celebration, it is an opportunity to be committed and to fight for freedom and for rights, for our rights in the future. Well, thank you, Marco Cappato. Before I give the floor to Virginia Fiume, who will be chairing the next session, is, if everything is okay, and I hope it is, we can go on and we can start with the first session with the guests, our guest speakers in the first session. As Marco Cappato said, we're going to be talking about the possibility to use direct democracy tools in this field, and Virginia Fiume has the floor.
I hope we're fixing the problems with the translation. I have the pleasure of introducing this session, which has a double-folded value. On one side, it's the nascent network of cannabis activists that are willing to activate the instrument of participatory democracy that is available at the EU level, which is called European Citizen Initiative. And on the other side is a sort of a backup and a network of power for the Italian activists who promoted the referendum campaign in Italy. In my view, and in the view of EUmans, there are certain matters that need to be tackled at a EU level also to benefit those living in the nation member states. So I think the opportunity today to look at some specific angles of cannabis legalization across the EU is a way to understand the need of proceeding also at the EU level in itself. I don't want to take too much time myself. I'd rather have our activists present their angles. So to introduce the speaker, we have Derek Bergman, chairman of VOC Netherlands, João Taborda da Gama, partner at Grupo de Ativistas en Tratamento in Portugal, Georg Wurth, the CEO of the German Cannabis Association, Natalie O'Regan, legal specialist on drug policy in Ireland, Brendan Minich, the board member of CRAINN, and then we will conclude with Emilio De Capitani, who is the former head of unit of Public Liberties Committee at the European Parliament, who will help us to give a framework for paving the way for cannabis legalization in Europe. But my idea was to start from the individual member states and then to go toward the European approach. So the first person is Derek Bergman from the Netherlands. In the public opinion, Netherlands has always been the first place where it was possible to smoke, which doesn't necessarily mean legal. So I leave Derek to share with us the latest on the situation in the Netherlands. The floor is yours. I ask everyone to stay in 5 minutes so that we have a bit more time at the end for some Q&A. So both on social media channels and in the chat, if you want to prepare your comments and questions, we will read it at the end of the session. The floor to Derek Bergman from VOC.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you for having
Grazie
me on
mille
this
Virginia.
panel today.
Grazie per l'organizzazione di questo incontro oggi. In Olanda c'è ancora una proibizione, formalmente ancora abbiamo un divieto, ci sono delle norme molto rigide, anche la cultura a casa è illegale. Quello che è cambiato, direi, è che per circa 5-6 anni ormai i coffee shop che vendono la cannabis sono visti diversamente dal governo, sono inquadrati diversamente, è iniziato a livello nazionale ma adesso anche a livello locale. L'obiettivo è quello di indebolirli. Il denaro che è criminale del coffee shop viene investito ai livelli più alti poi. Quindi in questo modo viene considerato così che cercano quindi di minare, si cerca di separare il mercato tra cannabis e l'eroina e la cocaina, e i coffee shop stanno facendo molto bene a marcare questa separazione. Però è cambiato perché, come dicevo, si cerca di attaccare i coffee shop e quindi in realtà
for now, already 5 years, politics here has been working on what they call the weed experiment or cannabis experiment. And this is really a purely political compromise to not, to really slow down the process of further regulation and legalization in the Netherlands. So it boils down to 10 cities out of 101 cities that have
su 101 città che hanno i coffee shop, quindi solo il 10%, ci sarà questa sperimentazione di questi coffee shop che dovranno vendere la cannabis prodotta da produttori cosiddetti legali, ma in realtà è un incubo burocratico e ci sono tonnellate di formalità che non sono davvero necessarie, quando invece in Olanda regna ed è un dio il mercato libero, c'è la liberalizzazione ovunque, ma su questo particolare campo invece ci sono un sacco di regole.
That this is almost bound to not work. So this is one of the reasons why still, even after 5 years, there is not a single plant has been put in the ground. So you see now that from the local level, at least 2 of these 10 cities are now protesting the national government and saying, come on, do better. Now that Germany is going to legalize, we don't need this experiment. It's only a show. We need to go further than this and speed up the process. But as you can see from this little explanation, we are really going through the mud here. There's not much good news coming here from the Netherlands because, and to round this up, home growers is still very much an issue. People are evicted from their house about 1,000 times every year here in the Netherlands. And also the driving under influence laws is also a big problem that should be addressed on a European level, because a lot of people are losing their driver's license even 2 days after they smoke their last joint. So there has got to be some sort of action, I would say, on this specific issue. And then as far as VOC is concerned, for us, home growing is the #1 priority. And where you go from there, whether you go for cannabis social club system in Europe, non-commercial, or you go for more commercial coffee shop system, first has to be home grow, because that's also your guarantee. If the prices are too high in the coffee shop or in the club or wherever in the pharmacy, then you can at least grow your own. And so this, I think, should be a #1 principle for all cannabis activism. Make sure that homegrown is your priority. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much. Also because, as you pointed out, there are multiple layers of action. Of course, at a European level, it's very difficult to identify an angle for EU legislation, and this is what we will try to explore also with Emilio De Capitani. But in the meantime, opening up a discourse among Europeans is quite important, and this is one of the things that we will try to do with the European Citizen Initiative. You mentioned Germany as one of the, probably the next one for legalization. However, promises of government agreements might not necessarily reflect the speed that is needed for cannabis legalization in Germany. So I'm very happy to leave the floor to Georg Wurth to explain us the difference between the possibility of legalization in cannabis as an output of the recent new government and the reality on the ground, and what are the German activists doing right now, and how also this frames into a European wave for legalization. So Georg Wurth, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. What the activists are doing right now, they are demonstrating 2 kilometers away from here in the city of Berlin to get legalization on the road. And especially what we discuss at the moment here is to stop prosecuting consumers right now, because it's clear it will take 2 years or something to debate all the details of legalization until we have those special shops to sell cannabis. But it would be much easier to say, well, let the people alone with only 10 grams or 30, whatever, that should be legal, like we have it in Malta first time now in Europe. But at the moment, it doesn't look like they will. And as you said, it's only probably will Germany legalize cannabis. It's not a done deal. It's not safe or sure or something. And there are many obstacles that could stop the show. So it's like, are we going to Luxembourging? It's exactly the same situation as they had 2018 in the coalition contract. They wanted to legalize, and 3 years later they said, well, we don't. And they said it's because of European law. That was the main issue that was brought by the government of Luxembourg to say we can't legalize. And now here we see the plan of the government, and we see some politicians that are there for drug policy speakers of their fractions in the parliament, motivated, and they want to go forward. And they have their whole parliamentary group behind, who are not that much motivated than the others, than those special politicians. And that's a difficult situation, including the government. We have a 3-party coalition right now, and the Social Democrats, the biggest of them, who are also having the chancellor at the moment, the Social Democrats, were the ones who were not calling for legalization. They wanted just to have some model projects like Switzerland is doing it right now. And they have the health ministry, which should do it, right? They are meant to lead the way. Of course, other ministries are also included in the debates, but they should do it. And well, it's Corona pandemic, and he said a few weeks ago, it's not on our plans for this year, maybe next year, maybe this year if there's some time coming from somewhere. So the debates are going on, but in practice, we fear that it could go too slow to get it on the road and get the law done before the next elections come. And well, then we would also be Luxembourging. One of the problems they see themselves, maybe they could stop the show, are the international contracts, one of them, but there they understood that that's possible somehow, like Uruguay did and Canada did, and so why shouldn't Germany? That's no excuse anymore. And Bolivia made the perfect way how to go, get out of and get back in the contracts. However, now they say, well, the European laws are a big problem for us. They somehow forbid legalizing cannabis. We didn't have that on our agenda before too much. It was not a big issue before we had this decision of the government. But now, and after the withdrawal of Luxembourg, saying it's European law, our government also says, well, we have a problem there. We have to discuss that, the whole thing, with the European neighbors and partners. And if we don't get them behind us, if they want us to stop legalization, we probably can't do it. We have to negotiate there. I'm not really sure if this is right or not. And it is not really important what I think about it. If they think it's a problem, then it is a problem. And so it would be very nice to have that problem out of the way through the initiative, maybe helping it, that is perfectly clear that Europe is not in the way of legalization. If one of the member countries wants to do it, then the EU should definitely open the way to try it. We don't have that situation, and so I'm glad to be one of the 7 to bring in this proposal and get one problem away in our way to legalization. Well, so far, so much.
Thank you, Georg Wurth. Also for the audience, both in the webinar and on the social media channels, it's worth to remind that the European Citizen Initiative is the instrument that EU citizens have available to suggest proposals to the European Commission to activate new legislation or to change existing legislation, as well as to get an audition into the European Parliament, who again then can act on the request. It's gonna be a challenge when the European Citizen Initiative will be launched. We will need to collect 1 million signatures across the EU, reaching a specific threshold in at least 7 member states. So please consider this webinar as part of the preparatory work that is gonna be needed for this challenge. So talking about the different angles, there is also an element of narrative and perspective of what consuming cannabis means. And I'm very happy to have with us, Natalie O'Regan, legal specialist on drug policy in Ireland. She's also she's gonna be one of the promoters of the European Citizen Initiative. And the focus for her today is exactly on the stigma about the consumption of cannabis. So I leave the floor to Natalie to give us some perspective of some stories that should be old, but are still ongoing.
Hi, folks. I hope you can all hear me. Okay.
Hello, I'm Brendan.
We tend to talk very fast in Ireland, so I will try and slow down so everybody can understand me speaking English. Like many other countries in Europe, Ireland is the exact same. We don't have legalization. We don't have decriminalization. We don't have grow your own. We have full criminalization of consumers. We have trying to change that in Ireland. There is many activists here that are working hard and working a lot to try and change it. But unfortunately, we're not getting very far with the government. They have zero appetite to change it. They almost still look at cannabis like the devil's lettuce, and it is the scourge of society, and it should all be evil and should be criminalized and everybody locked up in jail if you smoke a joint. So I'm glad to be part of this citizens initiative. It's one of the ways that us as European citizens can feel like that we have a voice, especially when you feel very ignored by your own government. Like in Ireland, there's not even a conversation, it's just refusal to listen. So trying to have an open dialogue and trying to get that dialogue going. And the EU Citizens Initiative is a very important step. Like all of us as EU citizens, we all have a voice, we all have a right to express that voice. And I think it is a very important thing. And thank you very much to Virginia and EUmans for organising this and getting it up off the ground. To give you a brief overview of cannabis in Ireland, it's terrible. Like we had a 6-year-old man convicted yesterday for cannabis plants for his anxiety. We have had medicinal patients criminalized for €4 worth of cannabis that they were found with, like dust in a grinder or something, I think they got. So they do push hard. They do criminalize a lot. Like if you go to the lower level courts here, it's full of cannabis. Like nearly 90%, 80% of the drug cases that you see at lower level courts are for cannabis in Ireland. So in my research, I looked at the stigmatization of people who consume cannabis and how harmful it is. So when you're stigmatized, you're outcasted from your society, from your family, but also adding on top of that, being called a criminal, being named a criminal, having your details published in the media, your address, your name, your age, your job. It's not conducive to anything the justice system is supposed to represent, which is rehabilitation, and it just does the complete opposite. Rather than trying to rehabilitate people, it just outcasts them further, and it just creates so many problems for them in society when it comes to visas, when it comes to jobs, trying to get certain jobs, you have to get police clearance, education, like you name it, and criminalizing people will have a knock-on effect. And every issue that comes from criminalizing people who consume all types of drugs, not just cannabis, can be put back down to just that label of being a criminal and that you've done something wrong. So by trying to change the narrative and trying to show people in Ireland that we're all not just stoners, like people who consume cannabis are normal, everyday people. They go to work, they come home, they have children, they get married, they go on holidays. Like these are not people who should end up in the criminal justice system. And I think that is one of the most important aspects that we do have to change about cannabis, is the stereotype that has been portrayed to us and portrayed to us by the media and by the justice system. Like some of the comments that the judges make here in Ireland about cannabis consumers are just horrible. Like one comment was, you can't access mental health services until you're clean. So they then had to get urine samples to show that they didn't consume cannabis when they consumed cannabis to help their mental health. So we have a long way to go here in Ireland. Like we are still stuck in 1977 when our Misuse of Drugs Act came around. The stereotyping, the attitude towards cannabis consumers is still stuck in the 70s. It's still stuck in the war on drugs. And our government is just reinforcing the war on drugs. It is continuing to criminalize people. It is not opening a dialogue for us to have a conversation. Everything is just shut down at the first hurdle. We were supposed to have a citizens' assembly this year, which was like a working group of citizens to inform the government of public opinion. And that has now been pushed to next year. So the issue with this being pushed forward is the government have only 18 months, 20 months left to run before we have another election here. So this working group, by the time they meet, they make their recommendations, they submit their recommendations and they submit their report. This government will be facing another election. So very much like Germany, they're not going to make any drastic moves on drug policy when there's an election impending because they don't want to lose votes. So we are trying to push this as hard as we can. But I think the EU Citizens Initiative is something very, very important that we can all have in our back pocket, like when we are conversing with our government reps, that if the EU does remove the blockages that there are to cannabis legalization from member states will have autonomy to choose their own path when it comes to cannabis. And I do think that's what every member state in Europe needs. So I don't think I have anything else to say. I've probably talked too fast, so apologies. But just pop in any Q&As or any questions that you may have and I'll answer them.
Thank you very much, Natalie Reagan, also for mentioning another instrument of democratic participation, which is the sortition-based citizen assemblies. We can look with optimism to the instrument, given that it was also the door opener for other reforms in Ireland, such as the law on abortion and LGBTQ rights. So it's worth to try and push for the activation of the sortition-based citizen assembly and maybe support you in Ireland to activate these instruments, which of course, with of course the limitations of the electoral time frames, which are always tricky, and that's why we need to be creative in the instruments that we use. I suggest we stay in Ireland with Brendan Minish from the, and correct me if I pronounce it miscorrectly, from the CRAINN network, which is a community of over 25,000 members in Ireland. So Brendan was supposed to send us a video, which he sent, but since he's here in person, Brendan, maybe you want to add something on the perspective that Natalie shared with us.
Hi, Virginia. Thank you for bringing me in, and it's slightly short notice now that I have to do this thing live. So I'm Brendan, and I'm a member of the board of CRAINN. CRAINN is a voluntary, is a group that grew out of Reddit, really. So I'll stick a little bit to the script because it will help your translator, I hope. So Reddit, we have about 30,000 cannabis enthusiasts on Reddit, mostly based in Ireland, and we set it up in 2010. As just to help people kind of come together and share information and things. And during the, as the community grew, we had to get more involved in the moderation side of things. So I guess we grew out of the moderation, really. So back to the script for a bit. Through the COVID lockdowns, the Reddit grew a lot, and there was a lot more discussion at this point. And well, people had time on their hands during the lockdown about how they might get politically involved in some of the activism. So we, in turn, have been increasing our presence on Reddit and also expanding to other social media platforms, Twitter, Discord, and Instagram. Discord has been really effective for us at engaging with the community and getting people involved in reform, because it's actually, you kind of need to hold people's hand a little bit, because when people have been kind of keeping their cannabis use secret, you know, because of the stigmatization and the legal risks and everything, it's hard to get people out to the point where they'll engage, to write letters to their politicians and things. And to be honest, just to add a little to that, from my own perspective, that's been quite an eye-opener, because, you know, in my professional life, I've always found politicians very willing to engage on matters. So engaging on cannabis has been a real eye-opener in how fast the door will close when they don't wish to talk about it. So our own approach in terms of CRAINN around activism has been very much approached around harm reduction, because on Reddit, our user base is young. It's a lot of college students and things like this who don't have much knowledge, and, you know, a lack of knowledge places people at more risk. So we've very much focused on harm reduction and education. And we've been encouraging people to engage politically. And today we have a good number of our members out on the streets in Dublin under a licensed public information day. We've got permission from the Gardaí to be there, and we are leafleting and informing people about cannabis and some of the facts around it, because as Natalie alluded to, a lot of the policy here is based very much on stigma and fear, and it's really still very much rooted in the sort of height of the drug war messages. So, you know, just say no and all of this sort of stuff. And as Natalie also discussed, the issue here is it's still highly illegal, and many of the cases going to court are for less than a gram. Now, one thing that did happen last year, we had an adult caution scheme introduced for the personal possession of small amounts of cannabis. The law doesn't define what a personal amount is, and as such, this scheme is only at the discretion of the police officer that you're engaged with anyway. So the adult caution scheme means that on a first offence, a first personal possession offence, that someone may be able to avoid a criminal conviction by taking an official caution from the police. In 2021, about 1,600 cases of possession were handled by this system, representing about 10% of all possession cases. So it is working, but at the moment, it's only diverting a very small number, really, of the cases that are coming in. A big problem in Ireland are the rapid rise of synthetics. And this is a problem that has been really brought it to a head by both COVID and Brexit, and also a cultural shift in consumption methods, because if you are trying to research cannabis online nowadays, you find good information from North America and other countries where they have legal regulated markets. And this in turn encourages people to consider good practice in harm reduction, maybe use vapes, edibles, oils. But of course, these are all products that are much easier to counterfeit. And the supply chains in cannabis, in Ireland for cannabis relied heavily on imports through the UK. And now that Brexit has taken place and customs checks are very much more in place on the border with the UK, and as a result, a lot of dealers have resorted to cheaper counterfeit products to make sales, and this is having consequences, specifically on the newer customers who wouldn't maybe prior to COVID lockdowns have experienced cannabis. So it's difficult for people to actually even have the knowledge sometimes to recognize what's in front of them. The synthetics that arrive here are often pre-packaged as edibles, vapes, and other novelty products, and the packaging emulates pretty closely what's available in legal markets. We don't have much Irish data on the prevalence of synthetics, but we do from Wales, and a Welsh study tested products sold as THC e-juice and found that only 3% were THC as advertised, and the rest the largest majority of the rest consisted of a chemical known as AB panaca, which is quite a dangerous synthetic and has killed people in some countries. There's no real research on Ireland. The state isn't keeping track on what's out in the marketplace. Stuff that's being seized by the police isn't systematically being sent for analysis, and it's all anecdotal. However, our own community tells us that synthetics are a major problem at this stage. Natalie also talked of the Citizens' Assembly, which is to be held. Now, it has been delayed, but we see some optimism in this delay, because the more this is delayed, the more knowledge and information from elsewhere can be fed into this process to counter really what is quite an out-of-date Irish narrative around drugs policy. The Citizens' Assemblies as a process are interesting because they consist of about 100 citizens who meet away from the partisan politics to examine and influence policy in a way that represents Irish society. It's been really useful in the past, and we're hopeful this one too will be. However, it is worth noting that prior Citizens' Assembly looked at quite simple things like abortion legislation. And what I mean by simple things is that we had a change in the constitution that must be made, and that was primarily the recommendation they came out with. With drugs policy, it touches so many different areas of other policy that I fear that what will come out will be some very solid recommendations, followed by quite a number of years of political horse trading around how they're implemented. So yeah, we are looking forward to it, but the pressure needs to be kept on for the government to make it happen. And here in Ireland, like the rest of Europe, there's a real appetite for change. and the voices of reform are getting louder. Together we're stronger, and we believe that real progress is now near at hand. And we look forward to working with all of you to make progress on this in the next year or two. And we're confident we can get a lot of people to sign a suitably worded EU petition from Ireland, and we look forward to engaging on that. Thank you to everybody who organized this, and I'll take questions from anybody who has them.
Thank you very much, Brendan from CRAINN. I see there is a number of comments in the chat of the webinar and maybe also on social media channels, comments around the therapeutic use of cannabis, but also there is an interesting question that I think it's important to keep in the back of our mind, but the webinar in itself will reply to that. The question is from Stina Adriasen, who is saying, why we invest so much energy in politics if we just can smoke and grow and live independent so free? I think the previous comments made the point, which is that it's not so free. And so we need politics to change things and create really a safe space for all type of consumers. And I think the webinar is part of the reply to that. So we have now João Taborda da Gama from the partner at Grupo de Ativistas en Tratamento in Portugal. He's going to bring us both the perspective of Portugal, but also the experience of citizens activation there, and is also another organization that is going to be part in the near future of the European Citizen Initiative. So João, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for inviting me. Hi, everyone. I will take my time. I will speak a little bit of what's happening in Portugal and what are the main challenges ahead. As you all know, Portuguese decriminalized personal use of drugs up to certain quantities that were determined by judges in 2000. That it was an experiment in the beginning, and now it's a model that's used in other countries, has worked well. There are some critics, but it's worked well. It's much better than it was before. HIV transmission cases went down, overdoses. We went from the worst in Europe to the best cases in Europe, and it served well the purpose. After that, Portugal legalized medical cannabis in 2018. GAT was I'm a pro bono legal consultant at GAT. I don't speak for GAT as a whole, but I know that GAT was very involved in both of these fights, both in the decree of 2000 and 2018 for medical cannabis, which, as you know, historically has been associated also with HIV and Hep C patients for the alleviation of some symptoms, both in Canada as in the United States and Germany, and other countries. And now what we are working on is trying to get a regulation from the Parliament for the adult use of cannabis. There were initiatives in Parliament from 3 parties last year. Then the Parliament was dissolved, and we have a new Parliament and a new government since January this year. And GAT is working closely with the Health Commission in the Parliament and with the political parties, bringing experts to this discussion when it starts. It has not started yet, because the Parliament just started. So the Health Commission was just formed earlier this week or at the end of last week. And that's the framework. Portugal followed Germany in the medical cannabis legislation, but Portugal was ahead of other countries in regulating the cultivation and production of medical cannabis. It means that there is in Portugal at least 20 companies that are producing cannabis for medical uses, mainly for export and mainly to Germany, to simplify to Germany. This is the context that we have now. So when the Parliament is going to decide about this, we have a good effects of the decriminalization policy. Even the political parties that were against this in 2000, now there's a national consensus that it worked well. So one time we were brave and it worked well. So doing something that is less brave, that's less risky, which is regulating like Canada did, or some states in the US, or like Germany is discussing right now, it's less adventurous than what Portugal did in 2000. Therefore, it collects a broader support in Parliament. And then I would say that we will have 3 issues to discuss that are not still yet settled. One is which model for the production and sale, which model or which model, meaning purely commercial, what rule for communities and for the state. Portugal is a very open economy, so I do not believe that the Parliament will vote for a state monopoly of any kind. But we have a left-wing government, therefore I'm sure it will be open to some community initiatives. One of the discussion points, of course, will be grow your own, or it will be self-cultivation. Some people are some political parties have shifted their position. There is one left-wing party is very active in defending cannabis, that has advocated for a model of social clubs and now shifted to a more commercial model. But these parties still are very strong on self-cultivation. Self-cultivation, as you all know, creates a scare which of course is disproportionate. We all know that, but politicians, they deal with perceptions, as you all know. One thing, that when Portugal decriminalized drug possession, we have not decriminalized cultivation. So we still have news of people that are caught with like 2 plants. Just last month, there was news of a 6-month investigation to put in jail, or at least in preventive jail, 2 persons because they have 2 plants, because it's still a crime. So we also have that problem with cultivation, not with possession of the product after it's been grown, which is slightly complicated, and that will be one problem. So what's the base for self-cultivation, the political base? That's one discussion that we will have. The second discussion, as we are seeing everywhere, is what's the compatibility of this type of policy with the UN drug conventions. We have to remember that when Portugal decriminalized in 2000, the UN conventions argument was already there, and Portugal nevertheless went ahead and decriminalized despite threats of being in breach of the UN conventions, and it went well. Now we have the example of Canada. We'll have the example of Germany. I know that everybody is now developing and studying, and there are very good theories that some type of decriminalized model is still compatible in some way with the UN conventions. One curious fact is that the Portuguese Prime Minister that decriminalized drug possession is currently the UN Secretary General, which is a fun fact of history, an irony of history. And he was very, very progressive, although he's a conservative socialist left-wing. He was very progressive in 2000, and now he stands as Secretary General of the UN, which is interesting, very interesting. So this is another thing that will have to be sorted out. And then the last thing that I believe it's important to discuss is what kind of social justice measures can a law like this have in a country like Portugal, where drug possession was already decriminalized, which means that if we want to have measures with impact, of course, you can clean the criminal records before 2000, etc. That's the easy part. But how to bring more social and transitional justice with a law like this, will have to touch the small dealers and small sellers part of the incarcerated people, which of course will create, will be a dogma and a stigma for, like, let's say, the center or the average member of parliament or the average party, like putting out of jail people that are in jail for selling small quantities, but they are in jail for selling, because we don't have in jail people for using. We have some cases of that were not proved, that was not proved that it was a personal use, but it's just it's not big numbers. So therefore I always see difficult how can these these social justice measures be implemented in such a system. Portugal is slightly different than the US in terms of impacted communities, and therefore that's something for the Parliament to discuss and to debate. In Portugal, as opposed to what's happening in Italy, or as we have seen or are seeing with psychedelics in some cities of the United States, in Portugal, decision making is the participation of citizens is very important, but it's made on a quieter tone than in other countries. It's like we don't have like 600,000 signatures for a referendum. We don't have very big public demonstrations. Things work in a different way. It's cultural. It's not better or worse. It's just different, meaning that things are happening, but they are happening quieter than in other places. The other thing that was important, I didn't mention and I forgot, in 2021, GATT, the NGO, which I'm one of the legal advisors, and I'm representing here. GATT came up with an open letter to Parliament in the most important Portuguese newspaper, where 60 people, important people, signed for adult use legalization. And among those 60 people were former ministers of justice, former ministers of youth and education, former ministers of youth, judges, scientists, one priest. It was a very broad spectrum of people that are very famous in Portugal and are very unexpected signing such a letter. And that created a real impact on the average voter and on the average member of parliament, saying, well, if these people are pro-cannabis, I never thought they would be pro-cannabis. I have to think about this. This is not just the activists or just the companies or just the extreme left wing. This is people that in the past have never spoken about this or have never decided about this. And that was the strategy of GATT, because they knew these people were very progressive, but had not yet taken the chance to be outspoken about that. And we brought them together to sign a letter. And I think that strategy really, really worked. And there are more people wanting to sign a second wave of that letter. So this is what we've been doing. We have an informal steering committee that is following what's happening. We have people from drug policy, from psychiatry. The main argument, the main technical argument that we are seeing against adult use is, as you are all familiar, is the mental health argument. Portugal has a high number of cannabis users. We are among the top of European in terms of intensive cannabis use. Intensive cannabis use, I think we rank number 2 in Europe. And therefore the people are worried with that. Which means that in the debates, it always comes up the schizophrenia / psychosis argument. And that's the main argument that people are doing. It's not a moral argument. We also have, like in Italy and in other countries, a surge of cannabis light or CBD shops, which is creating some confusion. I believe that is good for the debate and for our goals, as politicians will probably want to solve the problem, and therefore, since they have cannabis being sold in the main street, which is low THC, but people treat it as cannabis, the same, will probably create an incentive. I had my alarm clock for 4:20 in Portugal. It's 4:20 in Portugal. I think it's a good time to finish.
And it's a perfect alarm, because I was going to ask you to go toward the conclusion, because we are a bit late.
I'm done. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for the invitation.
Joao. Also, you open up a lot of angles for future webinars on the European level. And you also mentioned a big part of the topic that will be tackled in the next session, which is exactly the role of international conventions and how they are used as an excuse, and how this can be somehow counterattacked. So the last speaker of this session is Emilio De Capitani, who I chose as the last one because he's going to exactly bring us toward how to change the regulations. So from a European Union perspective, Emilio is going to try and help us to understand which is the angle to create the conditions for legalization of cannabis in Europe. It's not a direct competence of the European Union, of course, but there is always an angle. This is how we built the European Union itself. So Emilio De Capitani, the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes, 5-6 minutes, to give us the European lenses, which is going to be the grounding of
Quindi la parola a lei ci dà un po' il contesto delle iniziative cittadine europee.
Grazie a tutti voi che siete i veri esperti della materia. Io sono solo in parte un tecnico legato al diritto dell'Unione Europea, quindi
know about European legal rules, but I probably say things that you already know about. But I'll try to sort of give you the legal context. Currently, legislation about narcotics is a framework law dating back to 2004, a period when the law-making power belonged to the Council, therefore to the member states, whereas the role of the European Parliament was not decisive at all. They were just witnessing what the Council was doing. At the time, in 2004, and the framework decision of that year is still in force, well, that was adopted unanimously. Things have changed. And in 2009, we had the Lisbon Treaty. From then on, it was possible to adopt new rules about narcotics with the shared responsibility of the European Parliament and with a qualified majority without unanimity. That is important because narcotics are part of the EU competence, both in terms of health care and legal cooperation in the criminal field. Well, despite the Lisbon Treaty has been in force for over 12 years, no one was brave enough so far to review what was stated in the framework decision in 2004. And what did this decision say? It obviously referred to the UN conventions 1961, 1971, and therefore it defined a legal framework whereby theoretically the European Union could make different decisions from the UN, but in reality it doesn't do it because it doesn't want to create problems or put the member states of the EU in a difficult position vis-a-vis those conventions they have ratified. So in the last few years,
assistito e dall'interno del Parlamento europeo.
what I could see from the EU Parliament, viewpoint, but also as an Italian citizen, the EU supports its members, but it does not review strategies or policies. I'm not sure whether this is due to fear, difficulty, or choice. So, in full willingness not to push that forward. There has been a meeting of the Committee on Narcotics in the United States, and the topic was international standards for reporting on cannabis and cannabis-related substances for medical purposes. And during that session, Spain, Germany, and Portugal and the EU took the floor. But the EU is not a member of the conventions. It's not a party to the conventions. So the EU, if it wanted to do that, it could be more innovative, and it could push the member states to be more innovative and go beyond the convention. Please note that the International Narcotics Control Board, the INCB, last month prepared a questionnaire to be circulated among civil societies to know how it's possible to keep cannabis use under control and how to update public policies in this area. But this is a UN initiative. Now, to be more concrete, narcotics can be added or removed from a list of the United Nations on the basis of decisions made by the World Health Organization. So on the basis of objective scientific evidence that is not easy to collect at world level. And maybe it's not easy even at EU level, but the EU has the possibility to add or remove substances or narcotics from the control mechanism on the basis of evidence again. And the proof of this is that in 2014, the old framework decision voted in 2004 was amended not to remove some items from the list, but in order to add synthetic drugs with a mechanism that allows the Commission to accelerate the addition of synthetic drugs in the list of substances to be put under control. So if you can add narcotics or substances, you can also remove them from the list, but this should be done on the basis of a much more advanced legislation and not on the basis of the old framework decision of 2004, because that framework decision does not define a strategy. Strategies are always defined by member states individually and not by the European Parliament. And the last strategy against narcotics 2021-2025 was adopted by member states with no role played by the Commission at all. Another thing I'd like to point out is that despite the Lisbon Treaty, in terms of drug control, we're still using the limited and not advisable tools that were used among the member states before that framework decision, before the Lisbon Treaty, sorry. So we should sort of make legislation more similar to the Lisbon approach in terms of narcotics. We should make an analysis of needs and demand before we criminalize substances. We have to bear in mind that on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty, criminal legislation is the last resort. You cannot criminalize anything. There should be some clear and objective criteria and proportionality. And we also need clear data about the situation. Unfortunately, if you take a look at the EU papers, in particular the plan against drugs 2021-2025, you will see that the goals, the targets are the leitmotifs of the home offices, of the interior ministries, and just repression with no mechanism to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of their initiatives. So, starting a citizen initiative aiming at making more efficient and more democratic this legislation is not an easy task. It's quite a hard toll. But the legislative framework is democratically insufficient. Initiatives are never considered by the EU Parliament or the national parliaments. I will conclude by saying that an initiative by citizens in this field should have as a legal basis no longer the old framework decision, because as I said, the Treaty of Lisbon has changed things, but it should be based on Articles 82 and 83 of the Treaty on the functioning of the European Union, and it should be based on rules about public health, even if we've seen with the pandemic that these rules about health don't give much power to the EU. That was all. Thank you.
I don't see any question in the chat. I just want to mention one of the comments to encourage others to make questions and comment both on social and on the webinar. Antonio says we need to involve more Europe in the national decisions. EU institutions could lead the way. So I think it's an encouragement for those of us who will be tasked to address the European Union. And thanks for hosting this session in the webinar. The word again to Marco Perduca.
Grazie Virginia, grazie a tutte le persone che hanno condiviso.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the people who have shared their national experience. As João was saying, in Portugal 22 years ago, it was possible to decriminalize, in Italy partially in 1993 with a referendum, so with being very vocally, and the Radical Party has contributed to changing the laws. So this Lisbon approach that should be adopted for decision in the field of narcotics, as Emilio De Capitani said, should really inspire us. So Lisbonization, so to say, would help. And thank you very much for saying that. We prepared a first draft of the European Citizens Initiative that maybe we should review. Now, we move a step further, speaking of international conventions, so we speak about the UN, but we also go across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, to hear what's going on in the home country of prohibition, so the US. And Leonardo Fiorentini will moderate this session.
Spazio di condivisione di informazioni, riflessioni.
Will provide a space for sharing information and so on that is hosted by a Manifesto, communist newspaper. Let's give you some numbers about the participants, the followers, because numbers are going up. Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you very much to all the people who have helped us organize this event. We have over 150 participants. So we're very happy about the number of participants. My task is to moderate this 1-hour session, and I would like to introduce it with a very Italian note. And the foreign guests will forgive me for that. I really believe that the study that Kenzi Zemuli will present in a few minutes is very important and very interesting, not so much for the conclusions, but for the approach adopted, which is the approach with which we historically look at the Convention of 1961. So we're trying to find a genuine interpretation of what the writers of the Convention or the drafters of the Convention had. And we are trying to find also an interpretation that goes beyond the time of drafting of the Convention. So this topic of interpreting the Convention and flexibility in the interpretation of the Convention that was referred to by the previous speakers is something that is very important also for the Italian debate about the referendum. I'd like to remind you that
che anche andando indietro a vedere la famigerata.
Go back to the Italian law piece of legislation of 1990. This confirms that Italy, at the time when Mr. Amato was part of the socialist government, Mr. Amato is now the chair of the Supreme Court in Italy. He applied the conventions. In 1990, cannabis was part of the fourth table of the convention signed in 1961. The list of substances that were considered particularly dangerous and to be placed under control. Well, in 1990, when this control mechanism for cannabis was underway, well, Italy decided to criminalize less cannabis than other substances, although cannabis was in table number 4, as I said. So in the last century, Italy had decided a different interpretation of the convention. It was more flexible, and Italy reclaimed its sovereignty vis-a-vis the convention of 1961, but also 1971 and 1981. So I will immediately leave the floor to Kenzi Zemuli for his presentation. The floor to you, Kenzi.
Yes, hello, thank you, Leonardo, thank you, everybody, every panelist before for the very interesting insight into the national developments in Europe. And thank you for the invitation. Maybe I'm going, so it was a bit a short notice, but luckily I did this this short slide a couple of weeks ago, last week actually in Bologna, which I can use to help you present this very dense, very long legal report analyzing the convention that was just published. If you have the link over there, if you want to read it. And so indeed, you have several sides, several elements in this report that I think are interesting or can be interesting separately one from the other. One is this something that has already been said by a lot of scholars, interpreting the object and purpose of the treaty as being the health and welfare of humankind, and not the prohibition of drugs, which is an important element, because you have to read and interpret the treaty in light of its object and purpose. So if its object and purpose are prohibition, obviously all of the specific provision in the treaty will be geared toward prohibition. If the object of and the goal of the treaty, the object, the purpose is health, protecting the health and welfare of humankind by applying specific measures to substances that can have a potential for health hazards, then you can interpret all of the provisions in a way that allow that does not make of the drug control treaties prohibition treaties. So it's easy to find that in the so contrary to what is said on Wikipedia, and I saw before in the chat people referring to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is not necessarily the best reference you can have in a number of fields. Here we see Wikipedia says that the single convention is a treaty that prohibits drugs and have a small exception to allow medical use. When actually it seems to me, when I read the treaty very genuinely, that the treaty is completely geared around allowing medical uses. All of the disposition of the treaty talk about doctors, pharmacists, the pharmaceutical sector, prescriptions, what kind of prescription and the paperwork doctors have to do, and so on and so forth. And it has, to the contrary, this small exception that allows prohibition in some extreme cases. And I argue that this shift from the treaties that were thought like treaties to regulate this medical pharmaceutical sector and give the opportunity for countries that want to prohibit if they want to, the shift from that to prohibition treaty, drug war treaties, was pushed by the United States with their important weight and role in the later 20th century. But the treaty, when we read the title, the preamble, and the text of the treaty, we don't find so much elements that focus on prohibition. Actually, the word prohibition is very scarce in the treaty. And one of it appears for a number of activities or minor activities: prohibition of stocking drugs in warehouses, prohibition of doing specific kind of activities. The word prohibition of drugs, really, with this word per se, is not present in the title, is not present in the preamble. We don't have the word prohibition in the preamble, which is a statement of intent of the treaty. We only have it in the lists, the annex, the schedule 4, where cannabis was placed before, but not anymore. So the only mention of prohibition directly related to prohibiting uses of the plant and all activities related, including for legitimate purposes, like you could imagine medical use could be, is present in this provision that apply only to drugs listed in Schedule 4. Cannabis is not listed in Schedule 4 anymore, so cannabis is not listed in any provision that directly mention prohibition. I talk about cannabis as a drug because then we have the cultivation, which is a whole different issue, but that's something that is important to consider. We don't have any direct mention of, countries must prohibit cannabis. So you have to look for it. And I mean, when you look for it, you just don't find it. This, again, I'm trying to make you a short introduction to a very deep legal analysis that I should say relies on very conservative methods of treaty interpretation, which is basically textual interpretation. So fundamentally articulated around the text of the treaty, just the convention, the 61 convention, and nothing else. We try to understand what it means just with that. And if really we don't understand, then we go look into all of the discussions. It was 10 years of negotiations, all of the discussions that led to a particular provision. So again, when we had previous drug treaties that were talking about suppression, limitation, the 61 convention is just on drugs. It's not against, it's not for the prohibition of drugs, and it could have been because it's the case of many other treaties. So when people negotiate a treaty during 10 years, they have had the time to discuss every single word and comma. Again, prohibition is not present in the preamble. And when we go to the text, we have a number of issues. I said I rely on the conservative approach of relying really on the text of the treaty. We have a number of problems, which is, for instance, articles quoted in part, not integrally. So we have this article, which is always quoted like that. Countries have to limit exclusively the narcotic drugs to medical and scientific uses. But actually, there is a reservation, there is a subjection subject to some provision of the convention. Countries have to limit drugs only to medical and scientific use. You can find what it is subject to just by reading the treaty, but it's interesting that the commentary of the treaty pointed out at 4 or 5 occasions, saying the thing that this limitation to medical use is subject to is, among others, Article 2, paragraph 9, so which allows other than medical and scientific uses to be exempted. So what it says is that the uses for countries have to limit the use of drugs to medical and scientific use, except to this specific regime that is set up in the convention, except in the case of other than medical and scientific uses, where they have to apply that other regime, which is set out in Article 2, paragraph 9. Trying to explain that graphically can be interesting. We also have the concept of abuse, which is mentioned both for medical and scientific use, but also for other than medical and scientific use, so non-medical and non-scientific uses. And we have, in the case of one drug, say morphine, you can use it for medical and scientific uses. You can use it under Article 2, paragraph 9 for other than medical and scientific uses. Again, the commentary and the people that redacted the convention mentioned this exemption of morphine, which is used in processes of photography, just morphine, which is not medical use, not scientific use. It's somehow we could say it's a recreational use, photography, and it is exempted. It was exempted under Article 2, paragraph 9, or at least this article was sought to allow for this kind of exemption. And this would be therefore the goal, the purpose of the treaty, limiting the medical and scientific uses to this specific regime set out in the convention, and allowing, and as it's set out in the preamble, to protect health and welfare. So they have to reduce abuse in this regard and reduce the deviation. I don't remember the term in English now. The deviazione, it's the diversion from medicine to outside of the medical sector, but that doesn't necessarily imply that everything that is outside has to be illegal. And actually, it's clearly set out that purposes other than medical and scientific are exempted under this specific regime. It's not written anywhere that they are prohibited. So that gives us this sort of view of the goals of the treaty and where non-medical use fits. It is in this exemption under paragraph 2, Article 2, paragraph 9 that I just mentioned. So it's an article that was much debated during the 10 years of negotiation, and it was really mentioned as something important for the future. So they put in the balance, having in the 61 convention, either a very flexible process for amending the convention to allow to make it evolve swiftly in the future, or having Article 2, paragraph 9. In the end, they decided not to have a flexible and easy way to amend the convention, but to keep Article 2, paragraph 9. So they really expressed that this would be has the same value as an amendment to update the convention somehow. Is something thought for the future, and that has a name in international law. It's called, it's been called intertemporality. And indeed, it's one of the very few, or if not the only opportunity to be so-called flexible. And when I say I apply a very conservative approach to treaty interpretation, is that I don't allow any flexibility. Conservative approaches don't consider international law as being flexible, except when it has been thought for being specifically flexible in specific disposition. And this is the case here, as expressed by the drafter. But again, if we stick to the text of the treaty without being into the supplementary means of interpretation that can be the text, the discussions. If we stick to the text of the treaty, they rely on very vague terms, not defined, very broad, and that's also signs of intertemporality that we can find directly in the text. There is so this is again, intertemporality allows to consider a specific disposition in the present context, whereas you usually have to read a treaty in the context of its conclusion. So you usually have to understand the 61 Convention in the context of 1961, except in the case of Article 2, Paragraph 9, because the people that wrote the convention said, hey, you guys in the future, this is for you to use similarly as you would have used somehow an amendment to update the convention to allow flexibility. One point that is controversial is I'm going to skip, there is this mention of denaturation. So people say the Article 2, Paragraph 9 is fine, you can exempt drugs, but you have to denaturate them. No, you have to denaturate them or apply any other means. And that's very clearly written in the treaty. It's either denaturation or any other means. And for what? For reducing abuse and harms. So when you consider that the article was written to be interpreted in the future, we are in that future. In the future of today, how do we reduce harms by other means than denaturing the substances? Because I don't think anybody is going to buy denaturated legal cannabis. How do? We apply harm reduction. And that's what we can understand or what we can apply in interpreting this article, saying state exempt drugs by not applying denaturation, but applying other means in order to reduce abuse, which is substance use disorders, as it was understood in 1961, as it was called in 1961, and the harmfulness of substances. So it's basically harm reduction. And then countries have to report to the International Narcotics Control Board in a special form where we have already a section that is present to report that. So we could, a country could adopt this interpretation to legalize non-medical cannabis and claim full compliance in good faith and relying on very conservative method of treaty interpretation. Beyond that, you cannot use this claim. You cannot use this claim, but what is interesting is the confirmation of the fact that not only the treaty is not a prohibition treaty, but the removal of cannabis from Schedule 4 2 years ago is the only thing that has directly changed the will of the drafters. The drafter initially had written an article that was called Prohibition of Cannabis in the draft of the convention. It was called Prohibition of Cannabis, and it was here to prohibit cannabis. And during these 10 years of discussion, they decided to remove that article and instead to place cannabis in Schedule 4. So it would not be a mandatory prohibition of cannabis, but with the Article 4 that I showed before on the screen in Italian, they would have the option to prohibit cannabis. So the prohibition of cannabis was embedded into this placement in Schedule 4. By removing cannabis from Schedule 4, somehow we have amended the will of the, it's not us, it's the state parties to the 61 Convention have amended the wills of their predecessors. And that's somehow an important thing to consider, as McNair, Lord McNair, who was a very respected scholar, said amending the annexes of a treaty with a specific process, just like the one the Commission on Narcotic Drugs has done, is amending the treaty, because the annexes are a full part of the treaty. So there has been already an amendment of the 61 Convention related to cannabis 2 years ago, if we read Lord McNair, and somehow this amendment already provides a new possibility, and in particular reinforces interpretive approaches that free us from this perception that the treaty is a barrier to everything. It may not be as much as a barrier as we thought, and even less since this removal from Schedule 4. I'm finished with that. I advise you, if you're interested or curious, to go read the article. Of course, there are a lot of other legal arguments, but I always, I think, to finish, there is this principle called ut res magis valet quam perat, which is you have to always read the sentence, the provision of a treaty, in a way that everything in it makes sense. You cannot just say, oh, these couple of words over there, they probably just, you know, random, it doesn't make sense, or it's void of effect. It is not. So when we have the treaty that is truncated in citations by the NCB or by a number of scholars, it's problematic because it goes against this well-asserted principle that goes back to Grotius of ut ret magis valet comparat. And again, the denaturation or any other means. I don't know why we ignore the or any other means, which is clearly written there. It's just basic logic, but it's also ut ret magis valet comparat. Thank you for the attention.
Grazie a Kenzie Riboulet-Zemouli.
Thank you, Kenzie Riboulet-Zemouli. Very quickly, because we're late, I give immediately the floor to the next speaker, Benjamin Alexandre Jarrois, with Augur Associates. He has published a study based on the research work carried out by Kenzie, and he will dwell upon the EU legislation. The floor to you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Thank you everyone for organizing this wonderful conference where I think there's a lot of different ideas and things that are being challenged. And I think it's wonderful. I think that's what we need because the world is moving forward. Drug policy reform is moving forward. And it is accelerating. And to finish up on what Kenzie said, I think what's very important is that aside from the fact that I think it's a very solid argument, let's not forget that ultimately it is the sovereignty of the states to decide what they want to do and how they want to interpret international law. And there is this space that has been opened in this last years for, let's say, more flexible interpretations. And I think this is what Kenzie's work give to states that wish to move forward, and whether, you know, whatever we think, whatever we want, whether we're pro-reform or against, things are moving forward, something that we don't have necessarily an impact on what we can do, I think, is give options, give support. And I think that's what Kenzie's work wonderfully do. That said, my name is Benjamin, and I am the head of a consultancy agency called Augur Associates, specialized in cannabis. And I've been I'd say, drug policy reformer activist since the past 10 years, mostly in France. And we've published a white paper that intended to help states that want to move forward. And so we base our work mostly on Kenzie's latest research. So the first part is really about the different options that have been widely discussed, especially in terms of reforming and changing the conventions. Then all the more time closely reform that happened lately, whether it's Canada, whether it's Uruguay, whether it's the US federal position, which is a way to move forward while keeping within the spectrum of the conventions. And this first part really explains how potentially effectively we can argument that there's a way for countries to legalize their domestic cannabis market, adult use, non-medical. And then we move forward to because I won't repeat what Kenzie says, but we try to assess what it means for Europe in the second part. And I have to recognize two things on prior to this. First is I'm not the only one that worked on that report, but I am not a European international law specialist. And the second is that I think the second part of the report is the weakest, in the sense that I think it still lacks a lot of research that shows what could be the path. And I saw that Tom Blickman posted something on the chat right before, which I had to read a little bit, and which I find very interesting, although it doesn't include Kenzie's research. But one of the most important things that it shows that in Europe, the biggest obstacle is the framework decision of 2004. And I won't go too much into the details. I'll post a link afterwards if you want to read the report. But as Tom said in his paper, the issues doesn't lie so much into that framework decision. As we see, there is exceptions and countries that do things differently and that haven't been condemned. And we obviously think of the Holland example at first, but I'll get into the Maltese example afterwards. But we have Luxembourg and Germany coming on. So we see that the European legislation is not so much of a block, even if I think there's things that we could obviously change. And it says in that research that the issues lie into the conventions much more than in European laws, which I think is really interesting, because Kenzie's work, I think, give an option, whether we agree, give an option to states to legitimately argument and integrate domestically a new drug laws for cannabis, and I think it's just the beginning. What I would like to finish on is, I think, the Maltese approach, which I think is extremely interesting, because it bases its approach on two legs, and one of them is the crucial importance and structurality of harm reduction and public health, which I think is the most important things in terms of reform. And the second is to have established an authority that will have to report to the ANCB in the way that Kenzie's work describes. So I think it's very important that Malta is taking this approach, because it's a small country and has the ability to create innovative regulation with the specialty that it's an island, so it's less bothered by countries and borders issue, which is one of the I think the biggest issues in terms of European laws, and we see it in Germany and in Holland, and I think the Maltese approach will give a lot of, I think, inspiration to other countries. That doesn't mean, obviously, that we don't need to change the structural issues, but we do know how difficult and quasi impossible it has been till then, and we don't know what the future holds. So I think it's important, given the fact that we are not so many working in drug policy reform. I think it's a big family, because a lot of people have been working in there for a long time, but there is so much more contradictory interest that work towards keeping the status quo on. And I think we should take every opportunity, welcome every work and research when it's well done, to use as another tool in our toolbox. So I'll finish there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Grazie mille, Benjamin.
Thank you, Benjamin. Before giving the floor, to Grazia Zuffa, that there are different approaches to this issue. As you may know, Grazia Zuffa, in the last white paper, dealt with the possibility to change and amend the conventions, and there's been a webinar about this during the last session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and we're going to post the links on the chat. Now I give the floor to Grazia Zuffa, who is the chair of Società, della Ragione, who has been dealing with the conventions and their enforcement in the various state parties, and so she will comment what we said so far. The floor to you, Grazia. Thank you very much. I'll try and be short. I think the questions raised by the previous speakers are two, maybe three. What attitude should we have towards the conventions? What attitudes should the reformers have towards the conventions? And then, is it possible to interpret
più generale interpretazione che viene fatta del rapporto fra stati internazionali
in terms of a relationship between international treaties and national legislation? And then there's a last, more political question. Angas 2016 gave an interpretation of the conventions when he mentioned flexibility of the conventions, and some states have actually implemented this flexibility, like Canada, for instance. Obviously, not to mention the legalization in certain states of the USA. So I'm starting from a political remark. How have been conventions used politically and therefore interpreted in the last decades? The conventions have been manipulated, have been used politically to stop not only cannabis, but more in general, to create a blockade. I don't know if it was Leo or Marco Perduca who mentioned our referendum of 1993 in Italy that decriminalized personal consumption, but it left very heavy administrative sanctions for the personal use of cannabis. Well, the Board of Narcotics Control warned Italy that it was falling outside the convention. In March 2003, the NLCB warned the UK because it declassified cannabis. So it issued a warning against the UK. So what I'm trying to say is that so far there has been a very specific interpretation of the conventions, and this interpretation went hand in hand with the denial of national space to implement reforms. So the conventions occupied all the space. So there was a very, very strict interpretation of the conventions, together with a very strict interpretation of the role of international treaties and their primacy vis-a-vis national legislation. I'd like to recall that the UK when it was warned, said to the NCB that that was not its role. And the UK was right, because that was not the role of NCB. I think that the NCB has changed its role, and the political context has changed as well. And the UK remarked that the government was responsible for reforms it wanted to enforce, and the government was responsible about the compatibility of its own legislation with the convention. Now, going beyond the legal considerations, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert, and so I haven't got the skills and knowledge to analyze all these issues in legal terms. But according to me, we have to put the conventions in the historical context. This is extremely important, also in political terms. Place them back to the political context when they were ratified. Now, as reformers, we have to go back to the root of reform and to the meaning of reform. I think it's important to start a course of experimentation, in particular for narcotic drugs, because there are different cultures, there's a different social value and meaning attached to narcotic drugs, but also because narcotic drugs have a social value, and this is denied. This is usually denied because there's a biological and pharmacological approach to narcotic drugs. Individuals are taken as single entities that have to be controlled because the drugs create pharmacological harms. This is obviously not true, but I believe that experimenting could shed light on some social rituals, social rules, social conventions that have the role of risk reduction. So I think that speaking about a flexible interpretation of the conventions is very positive, because it opens some spaces, some room for experimenting. And when Fiorentini said, we as Italian reformers, we had to deal with the referendum that was rejected by the Constitutional Court, and one of the reasons was that it was not possible not to reduce criminal punishments or criminal sanctions, but to remove detention for cannabis. Well, we had to, what could be the right interpretation of the relationship between international treaties and national legislation? Not us, obviously, but the experts of constitutional law talked with us. They have stressed what was already said. There is always, when we're talking about international treaties applied to national to nations, to countries, there is a possibility to interpret. This is true because, for instance, in Italy, we have Article 10 of our Constitution that says that the Italian legislation adjusts to the international law, but it does not enforce international law automatically. So if it is true that we are going beyond the old scenario of the culture to the war on drugs, now this means that this seems to me that it is important to understand that we're not trying to delete the conventions, but we have a legitimate interpretation of the conventions. This is important because for cannabis, but also for other narcotic drugs, we need space and room for experimenting and possibly experimentation that is bottom up, not top down. So this doesn't mean that it's not, this doesn't mean that it's not possible to go beyond rules and conventions. There can be an agreement among states about a specific interpretation of a convention. For instance, an agreement that shows that 60 or 70 decades have passed, and so the goals of public health are different. Obviously, there's a general public health objective, but times have changed and also goals have changed in public health. So I believe that any possible space for experimenting has to be protected and used, and I will be very clear. The Angas resolution of 2016 is not an attack, an aggression to international law. And I do not believe that countries that legalize cannabis want to demolish international law. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Grazie, Zuffa.
Un piccolo soliti problemi di regia.
Thank you, grazie a Zuffa.
Passiamo dal
And now
quadro diciamo internazionale con invece passiamo
from the international context, let's go more specifically to the US. We have Mitzi Vaughn with us from DRC Net Foundation, and she'll talk to us about the situation in the US, where they have recently approved the MORE Act at the Houses of Representatives. And we are all looking forward to seeing whether the Democrat Schumer will introduce his bill, his proposal that has been announced. And we'd like to know what chances there are for the MORE Act and for the Schumer's proposal to be approved, to be adopted. Everything we heard so far would be impacted in a revolutionary way where Schumer's proposal be accepted. Mitzi, you have the floor.
Mitzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Happy 420. I'm Mitzi Vaughn. I'm on the board of the DRC Net Foundation and the Drug Reform Coordination Network. You might know us better from our platform, stopthedrugwar.org. I'm an attorney here in Seattle, Washington, and I'm going to kind of update you and help you understand the status quo with cannabis legalization or proposed cannabis legalization in the United States, because the MORE Act has gotten a lot of press, and things are a lot more complicated than they might appear from a distance. So the MORE Act passed out of the House on April 1st this year. The MORE Act is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. So it passed the House with broad support. 2 months prior, though, the Safe Banking Act also passed the House with broad support. The Safe Banking Act is the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act. While the MORE Act is a comprehensive, is legislation that is meant to comprehensively reform cannabis laws in the United States, to federally deschedule and to set regulatory floors for states. The SAFE Act is actually a very targeted and brief piece of legislation that attempts to free up our banking system to extend banking services to cannabis businesses, because cannabis is still a Schedule I substance in the United States, despite having 47 states with some level of legalization, some of them a very, very small level of legalization, but it's still federally prohibited. And so banks that are federally insured do not offer banking services, credit card payments, or loans. And so it's been very difficult for businesses not just to grow as a normal business, but it's caused a public safety crisis in the United States as, for example, in Washington, my state, the word is out that cannabis is a cash-intensive business, and so we're having armed robberies at an unprecedented rate. We had at least 50 armed robberies in just the first 2 months of 2022, which exceeds all of 2021. So that kind of gives you a snapshot of one state, and that's not just happening in one state, it's happening nationwide. Chuck Schumer has another bill that he's going to, with Cory Booker and Ron Wyden, introduce into the Senate at some point. We're not sure when. It was supposed to be this month. Now it's looking like next month. That will be titled the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. So that one's going to be CAOA. It's not as easy to say. That is also, like I said, comprehensive reform. It has a lot of similarities to the MORE Act. This was actually publicized last year as draft legislation, but not introduced into Congress. So as of right now, it's speculative that there will be this bill coming. It will look significantly different than last year's version that was just introduced as a draft to the public, because they have taken extensive comments in from the public. They actually request and sought comments. So we don't know what that did to the draft that we saw last year. What's really interesting in all of this is that these competing interests are colliding within the drug reform community, within the politicians who are now supporting drug policy reform. And what you're looking at is Chuck Schumer, who is the majority leader in the Senate, having his own project and not wanting to pass the Safe Banking Act because he wants comprehensive reform. There's all kinds of issues involved in this. The good news is that they include social equity and restorative justice. Both comprehensive reforms do. They make very specific tax allocations and program outlines in both. The problem is that if this doesn't pass by October, any one of these doesn't pass by October, we're going to have midterm elections and the Democrats are going to lose the majority. While we have good support on the Republican side, we're going to lose some of that power and probably all of the power to actually get any of this done. So you have this conflict occurring right now where the Safe Banking Act could pass if the majority leader wasn't blocking it in favor of comprehensive reform. And comprehensive reform, based on a bill that isn't even introduced yet, has very little chance of actually passing by October. It's just not feasible. So, you know, specifically to your question about the MORE Act, it has a 95% chance of failing. It would be very shocking if it passed, because it's a competing bill with Chuck Schumer's bill. And if the head Democrat isn't going to support it, it's not going to pass. So really the question is here, is the Safe Banking Act going to pass? Or is that going to get snared up in the effort to comprehensively regulate reform, which may be unrealistic? You know, I tell people I'm all for comprehensive reform, right? I've been working on this for a decade, and but I'm also practical. And so from my standpoint, it would be a shame if we lost an incremental reform in throwing all the energy at an overhaul that is probably not going to pass. It is so complex with the various states all regulating separately that trying to shove through a bill to govern something where you don't have consistent standards, measures, dosage, packaging, you don't have any of that consistency throughout the entire country. The good news is that in addition to restorative justice and social equity, both bills specifically contemplate import and export. I also find it interesting in the context of these conversations that nowhere does anybody talk about the UN conventions in any of these discussions. It's just not even an issue. So, which, you know, if 5 years ago it was a big issue, right? It was a big point of discussion domestically and with our international actors, with the UN. You know, I think the takeaway is, while on paper what's happening in the United States looks very exciting, and while we do have this critical mass to actually do something, whether or not it is enough to get comprehensive reform passed in this short period of time is a big question mark. And if you're interested to see what is going to happen, I would, you know, set a reminder for October to check out when Congress goes on break and one of these or all of these bills, you know, they haven't passed before the midterms. So thanks for having me. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Grazie mille a Miss Yvonne. Mi pare di capire che
thank you, Miss Yvonne. Antonella Soldo will talk about that with our Italian guests later on. In Italy, the situation is quite similar, with the difference that we don't have a competition between two different laws. We have just one law that we are trying to get passed in Italy. And now I'd like to give the floor to Giovanni Andrulli, who is a student at Bocconi University in Milan. He belongs to the healthcare hub of that university, and he'll illustrate a research project on the use of cannabis for legal purposes. And he'll speak about the potential research on harm reduction. Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. Hope you are seeing my shared screen. I'm going to illustrate some work I'm doing with the students of my university and with a professor who's a tutor also on the impact of cannabis legalization on consumption and a forecast of what might happen in Italy. I'll describe the goals of the project, the methods that are quite innovative, and the subsequent steps. First of all, we noticed as researchers in the field of the legalization of light or soft drugs, well, that there is a lack of data. And also there is the issue of the timing of research, the political timing of when you should publish your findings. These are two aspects that are typically critical in research in this field. And in order to improve the situation, we could use an RDD algorithm, RDD being a statistical technique that allows us to assess the impact of a policy over a given period of time. By using an RDD algorithm, we could analyze different data sets. And the algorithm would also allow us to be very time efficient because you can make forecasts before you have the data thanks to this algorithm. These are some target countries that we have compared with Marco Perduca from the Luca Coscioni Association. We analyzed data concerning the Netherlands, the US, Spain, and Malta. You can see the year when the substance was legalized and the percentage of consumption. These countries are close or similar, close to Italy, the Netherlands and Spain and Malta. And then the USA, we focus in particular on Colorado and California. In Colorado, they have legislation that is very similar to ours. And so it will be interesting to compare data and to make forecasts and comparisons with Italy. The methods we use are summarized in this slide. We have step one, research, and we have we use the RDD regression discontinuity design model. The algorithm analyzes two groups, a study group and a control group. There are two researchers in each group. They don't know each other. They work in parallel, and that guarantees that the study is independent, that the control group doesn't know what the goals of the study are, and that is going to allow us to obtain results, to obtain findings that cannot that are objective, that cannot be biased. And during step 3, we'll compare and develop the two algorithms, and we'll develop one final algorithm that will be used in order to calculate the impact of legalization in different nations, in different countries. So the next steps are illustrated here. We are looking for experts who are interested in taking part in our study, statisticians, AI experts, or anyone interested in these topics. We are also looking for new databases or data sets on which we'd like to test our algorithm, and that's necessary in order to obtain quality data about consumption by users from 18 to 30 years of age, for instance. So these are phone numbers and email addresses. If you're interested in cooperating with us, or if you have data sets that you'd like to try the algorithm on, please get in touch, and thank you for allowing us to give this presentation. Giovanni Andrulli was not harm reduction, as I said. It was actually an algorithm regression discontinuity design. And now I'd like to thank all the participants to this panel, and I'd like Giovanni, please stop sharing your screen. Thank you. And now we are 15 minutes late. I'll give the floor to Antonella Soldo. She's going to introduce the Italian side, let's say, the Italian part of our afternoon. And she'll guide us in a discussion about the contents and prospects of the Bill of Law that the Italian Justice Committee should decide about, and it's the Bill of Law on home growing.
Eccoci. Allora, come dire, arriviamo in Italia e qui casca l'asino, diciamo.
Well, here
Anche
I
le
am.
cose che abbiamo sentito in giro per
We'll
il
be
mondo
talking
sono
about
tanto più confortanti,
Italy.
ma un po'
The
di più
situation
sì.
in the rest of the world is
E
not
ci troviamo
that
questo 420
cheery or
un
cheerful,
po'
but
naturalmente
it's
con l'amaro in bocca
worse
per quello che
in
riguarda la
Italy,
situazione
and
italiana, come chi
we
stava
are
quasi per
quite
fare canestro con un
disappointed in
referendum,
Italy
e
because
siamo
we
stati
had
il paese che
we
più si è
collected
avvicinato a
the
un
signatures for a
referendum
referendum.
popolare,
We got
tutto
very close
online,
to
firmato
getting
da giovani,
a
eccetera,
popular
eccetera.
referendum
Eppure
that was
non ce l'abbiamo
the
fatta, non ce
signatures were
l'abbiamo fatta
collected
perché
online, lots of young people
la legge
signed,
sulle droghe
but
è una
we didn't
legge
make it
inemendabile.
because the law about drugs,
Questo
law on
abbiamo
drugs
appreso da questa
cannot
esperienza
be
referendaria.
amended. This is
E
what we
quindi
learned as we
investire
try
sul
to
lavoro
organize
del
a
Parlamento
referendum on it. So a lot
e sul mandare avanti
has to be done. We have to invest
qualcosa di piccolo
a lot of
che
energy into
possa
working
muoversi e andare
with and
avanti.
around the
Quindi, come nel
Parliament in
gioco
order to get
dell'oca,
something
torni alla
moving.
alla casella
Back
di
to
partenza
square
e
one,
ricominci da capo.
unfortunately, but we
Diciamo
are
la verità, non è
willing
che
to
ripartiamo
start
proprio da
again,
zero,
and we are
perché
not actually
il lavoro
starting
che abbiamo
from
fatto
square
è
one, because
tanto,
what we've
e
done
anche
so
il
far
webinar di oggi lo
is a lot of
dimostra. Noi
work,
abbiamo messo
and this
insieme le
webinar
forze
shows it. We have put
dell'Associazione
together
Coscioni, di Forum Droghe, delle
organizations,
esperienze italiane e delle
Luca
esperienze estere.
Coscioni
Oggi siamo in
Association,
grado
the Forum Droghe, and
di
many
realizzare
other
un evento come quello
organizations,
di oggi pomeriggio,
and
di
we
altissimo
can
livello.
organize things like
Quindi non
this
ripartiamo
webinar.
da zero
That
nemmeno
shows
nel
that we've
Parlamento,
done
ripartiamo dalla
something good so
Commissione
far.
Giustizia, dove giace un
Let's
po'
talk about
reietto questo
the
disegno
Justice
di legge
Committee.
per la
However, the
decriminalizzazione di
Justice
4
Committee has
piantine,
this
sul
bill of
quale
law
chiunque ha
on the
detto di essere favorevole, dal
decriminalization of the
procuratore
cultivation
nazionale Cafiero De
of
Rao
four
fino
plants. Everyone says
fino al
that they are in
Gandolfini,
favor of it.
al popolo delle famiglie, come si
Even
chiama,
the people of
eppure
families, an organization
non
called
siamo ancora
something like
arrivati
people
al
of
voto.
families and their representatives
Prima di
stated
dare
they're in
la
favor,
parola
but the bill
a
of
due
law
parlamentari
still
che ci hanno già
hasn't
raggiunto, Riccardo
been
Maggi ed Elio Vito,
approved or
che
accepted.
ringrazio.
And we have two
Aspettiamo anche
members of
Eugenio
Parliament,
Saitta
Riccardo
e Matteo
Maggi and
Orfini,
Elio
per avere
Vito,
un
who
po',
are
diciamo,
already
di
with us. We are also
rappresentanza
waiting for
dell'intero
Eugenio
arco
Saitta and
parlamentare.
Matteo Orfini. And we have
Voglio ricordare
invited these four
brevemente
people
come
in
siamo
order to have a good
arrivati
representation of
qual è la
the
genesi di
parties
questo disegno di
in our
legge per
parliament.
la decriminalizzazione di
Before I
4
give them the
piante.
floor,
La
a few
genesi
words
è quella
about the origin
di
of
un
this
partito che si
bill of
sentiva
law,
così
the
forte mentre stava al governo, la Lega di
decriminalization
Matteo
of
Salvini,
cannabis.
talmente
The
forte che
story
quando era al
goes as
governo, il famoso
follows.
governo
Matteo
giallo-verde,
Salvini's
con
party felt that they
i
were
5
so
Stelle
strong
di
when
Conte,
they
presenta in pompa
run
magna
the
un disegno
government
di legge che
with
chiama Droga
Conte's
Zero,
5
una roba del
Stelle,
genere,
and
Sofia,
they submitted a bill of law
in
that
cui
was called
propongono di
something like
inasprire le
zero
pene
drugs,
anche per i fatti di lieve entità
where
e di
they
tornare a una situazione di
suggested
violazione di
that harsher
incostituzionalità, perché ci
punishment
abbiamo
be
già avuto nel
introduced for anyone
2014 la Corte
using drugs.
Costituzionale che diceva che quelle cose non si potevano fare. Quindi
They
la
felt so
Lega presenta
powerful
questo
that they
disegno di legge
submitted
e
this bill
a
of law
questo si aggancia
very
Riccardo Maggi, che abbiamo
much
qui,
based
con
on
un disegno di legge
prohibition.
di segno
Riccardo
opposto che va a
Maggi,
modificare lo
Maggi,
stesso
who's with
articolo
us,
73 che era
submitted a
oggetto
bill
delle
of law
modifiche
amending
della Lega,
Article
però in senso opposto,
73,
mentre quelli proponevano
the
di
same
inasprire le
article
pene,
that
Maggi
the
proponeva di
Lega, the prohibition
renderle
law,
più leggeri e di
aimed at
decriminalizzare la
amending, but
coltivazione, perché
Maggi's
questo
approach was the
il
opposite, aimed
regolamento
at
parlamentare
introducing
lo consente,
legalization, and this was made possible by the
lo
parliament's
consente,
rules.
disegni di legge che vanno a intervenire sullo stesso articolo vanno discussi insieme e qui ci siamo trovati a fare una sorta di
To the
capriola
rules of
per cui abbiamo messo sul
Parliament,
tavolo
when
questo
there are
disegno di
two
legge che andava
bills
a
of law
decriminalizzare.
on
E
the
a che
same
punto siamo?
topic,
Lo
even
faccio
if
dire
they
prima a
have
Riccardo Maggi che in quella
opposite
commissione c'è
approaches
poi
and
do la
goals,
parola a
they'll be
Deio Vito
discussed
che ha
together.
creato una
And
preziosa
that's
sponda
why we are now
anche a
going to give the
destra.
floor to Elio Vito and
A te,
Riccardo
Riccardo.
Maggi, who submitted these bills of law.
Thank you, Antonella, to you and to all the people following us on different media channels. There was an extraordinary mobilization and the collection in less than a week of 600,000 signature for the cannabis referendum with a lot of enthusiasm, which was really an historical event. And then the Constitutional Court ruled out this possibility to have a referendum. And this opens up some questions. The first one was launched by Marco Cappato in the opening of this webinar. The Constitutional Court went well beyond the tasks afforded to it about referendums. And so there's some thinking to do about that. And I think that we should also start an initiative on this, a political initiative. Also, this judgment by the Constitutional Court, that abusive judgment to me, an unconstitutional judgment according to me, has relaunched, so to say, the ball to Parliament. You mentioned what happened in the last 2 years when the bill that is very, very specific about the single act about narcotic drugs, in particular Articles 73 and 75, with 3 different changes, very specific changes. Total decriminalization of home cultivation of cannabis for personal use. So the famous 4 plans that you mentioned, but the 4 plans all obviously involve the possession of the plants and of the fruit of the plant. And today, the judge has discretionary power to reduce the condemnation or the detention, but very often the judge does not reduce the sanction, and all those situations which are in a situation, sort of a gray zone between consumption and dealing, or small dealing, of very, very little quantities, where all of these type of gray areas are still criminalized. Then we have to talk about administrative sanctions. The bill that is being discussed in the Parliamentary Commission about Justice wants to abolish all the administrative sanctions for the cultivation and possession of cultivation at home and possession of cannabis. Now, the progressive parties in this parliament didn't want to deal with this topic. Even them, they were forced to deal with it because we used the procedure, the parliamentary procedure, and we coupled this proposal with another proposal that was put forward by the League party. So what did we get with this sort of shortcut? We were able to bring up the topic of cannabis during a plenary session of our parliament. We listened to medical doctors, toxicologists, experts, people who scientifically deal with cannabis and other narcotic drugs. And most of them were in favor of the proposal to decriminalize the home cultivation and possession of food plants. So they were basically in favor of this proposal. And this was crowned, so to say, in October last year when we had held a national conference on narcotic drugs. This is an institutional conference that should be held every 3 years in Italy, but it was held after 12 years. Well, during that session devoted to criminal aspects, again, we had a positive opinion by the national public prosecutor against mafia, Cafiero de Rao. They are in favor of that bill that we have submitted to Parliament. So, as I said, politicians didn't want to deal with the topic. We were able to put it on the agenda of the Parliamentary Committee for Justice, and we have put it amongst the amendments to legislation that have to be voted by Parliament, but we still have not had a discussion about it in Parliament. I have to say that we only have 6 months of time because then the electoral campaign will start. If we don't do that within the next 6 months, we will not have the possibility for this Parliament to vote about this issue. So we need to push forward our initiative. We mustn't stop to call upon all the political parties who define themselves as reformers. I'm thinking of the Democratic Party, the Five Stars movement. Why am I mentioning them? Because their leaders, Enrico Letta, the secretary of the Democratic Party, and the secretary of the Five Stars movement, Conte, they have repeatedly said that they want to support our proposal about cannabis. Even if they never said anything about the referendum, they are now saying that the bill that is now being discussed in the Parliamentary Committee for Justice is a bill that they support. But the Parliament never examined this bill, and this is something we want to draw the attention on. There must be a political will to go forward with this bill, because we have the numbers in Parliament. If only they put this bill on the agenda. And unfortunately, we're not strong enough to unblock this standstill in Parliament. But if we could just have this bill put on the agenda, we would have a positive vote. It would be approved. We need support in order to push this bill forward and bring it to the House of Parliament to be discussed. And I will conclude by saying something else. This bill of law, it's not a comprehensive reform that we would like to see. But as we heard from other representatives of other countries who are fighting in order to have a broader reform, the issue of decriminalizing the home cultivation is the first step that can have a trickle-down effect, because obviously it would generate, also in terms of legal interpretation by courts and so on, it would bring forward the contradictions that exist, and it would change the mindset as well. And we would also start to free millions of citizens from oppression. Citizens who daily use cannabis and are daily persecuted and sued in most of European countries. So we want, first of all, to correct that criminalization of the home production and of cannabis. But besides this, we have to inform the public opinion, and we have to ask politicians to take up their responsibility, because we know that when the electoral campaign starts, they will have to discuss other points about
Grazie a te, Riccardo. Solo una domanda, ma riprende questo dibattito oppure no? Perché le notizie che ci avevate dato è che alla fine della discussione del disegno di legge sul CSM che è arrivato in aula sarebbero riprese. CSM è in aula adesso e
debate about the bill of law, about the discussion of the reform of the Council of Judges, of magistrates, after that there would be the discussion of this bill. But as a matter of fact, the discussion on the bill hasn't started yet. We were told again and again that next week they should start voting the bill. But we've been reassured several
Andiamo
times.
Adesso da Elio Vito.
No, Elio Vito.
Grazie Riccardo Maggi. Elio Vito, parlamentare di Forza Italia, che è un po' il nostro cavallo di Troia, anche munito di maglietta di Meglio Legale, all'interno del centrodestra, diciamo la testa d'ariete verso il fronte liberale. E Elio, tu sei un parlamentare di grande esperienza e quando ci si trova di fronte a un impasse del genere, che bisogna fare?
Such a standstill, what should one do?
Well, I think that we are implementing a policy of a step-by-step policy, but these steps are very small. However, we have to thank the activists and the organizations like yours, because you managed to submit these issues to the parliament. There are contradictions in Italian law. We've made some progress with legislation on the possibility of using cannabis for medical purposes. For instance, we are going towards legalization of light cannabis with the CTB shops, and however, we are now faced with the contradictions of our legislation, because even when there is a legalization, there are still a lot of criminal activities, drug dealers, drug trafficking still exists. And even for medical cannabis, the supply of legal cannabis is limited, and that's where organized crime gets into this field. And now that the referendum has been so successful with the public opinion, but has failed with the authorities, we're now very aware of the fact that this is a topic that is of great interest to the public opinion, less so with politicians. Mr. Pierantoni, who's the chair of the Parliament's Committee for Justice, I voted in favor of the basic text of the bill, and the discussion is scheduled for the coming month of June. Of course, there are many amendments that have been submitted to the Committee for Justice. The basic text allows for home cultivation of a limited number of plants. It's hard to imagine that this will be accepted and passed by this parliament. However, we should not give up. The situation of political parties in Italy is not good. We have a right-wing parties that are very aggressive, and they tend to be non-scientific. They are not objective and biased against the use of cannabis, even if only for security and safety purposes. And they don't want to legalize, not even to stop organized crime from profiting from drug trafficking. Even if we have overcrowded jails and a lot of law enforcement resources that are invested and devoted to the war on drugs. So the right wing is very aggressive. As I said, on the left side, we have some very committed politicians. The Democratic Party in Italy is very shy about these issues. The Democratic Party very much appreciated the yellow traffic light party in Germany, where they asked for legalization of cannabis. It's not part of the political agenda of the Italian Democratic Party. So I hope that the lobbying activity of associations, that the pressure of the public opinion and the commitment of activists can make it possible for this topic to be brought to the attention of Parliament, so that it can be discussed. The Parliament should understand that this is a reasonable approach, and much more reasonable than the prohibition-based approach that we have at present. This is an approach that, because we decriminalize private use, we approve medical cannabis for medical purposes, but then the market is left open to organized crime and to drug traffickers. Drug pushing is still there. Even if there is the positive aspect of the removal of the fines and administrative sanctions or punishments against users. So, as I said, I don't expect this bill to be approved in the near future, but we need to keep fighting for the legalization of cannabis. It's a reasonable, a common sense measure that should be adopted. I mean, there are substances like alcohol or tobacco that are even more dangerous. Leaving cannabis to the to organized crime is nonsense, is nonsensical. And so I really think this is a topical issue, and there is a common sense, reasonable proposal that has reached the Committee for Justice, and I'm looking forward to
alla Camera dei Deputati, da cui si collega dal cuore delle istituzioni il parlamentare Matteo Orfini del PD, che ringrazio tantissimo perché so che oggi era una giornata particolarmente intensa e però è riuscito a collegarsi. Allora, lo ringrazio anche per esserci stati accanto in questo lungo percorso in questi anni, aver partecipato alle nostre cose, essere stato un po' da sponda, e perciò per la gratitudine che gli vogliamo non gli farò la domanda, e allora il PD. Però,
as we are so grateful, I won't ask him what is
cosa possiamo
your party
fare
doing
di più per aprire un
about
dibattito
cannabis
anche
legalization.
all'interno
I'll
dei
ask
grandi
you a
partiti.
milder question. What
Noi
can
abbiamo
we
lavorato
do in order to
tantissimo con i
open the
giovani
discussion
democratici, abbiamo
within
partecipato
the
a
large
numerose agorà
countries?
e
We
credo che
worked
l'agorà più
and
votata al
cooperated
momento sia
a
proprio
lot
una che
with
sulla
the
legalizzazione, un
Democratic
po' perché
Party.
l'abbiamo
We had
cammellata,
an
lo diciamo
agora,
onestamente, un po' perché
an
il
assembly
tema
with
è
the young people
sentito
in the
anche all'interno del
Democratic
PD, abbiamo
Party,
fatto dei sondaggi,
and we did some
però
surveys, and we realized that this was a topic
serve
that
un po'
was
di buona
interest to the
volontà
members of the Democratic Party, and so we cooperated
ce
quite
la
a bit
facciamo a dare
on
questa
this issue. But
spintarella nella
do you
Commissione
think
Giustizia,
we'll
onorevole?
make it through the Committee for Justice, and that the issue will be discussed and scheduled? Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I apologize for joining you from the courtyard of our Chamber of Deputies and during a break in our in our session. I'm not trying to dodge the question about what is the Democratic Party doing about it. We have to answer this question. Well, we have to do our best in order to bring forward this bill that is very moderate, very modest in its scope. Even if it's a reasonable piece of legislation, it is being questioned and challenged by conservatives. But I do hope we manage to get this piece of legislation passed by the lower house of our parliament. And then, of course, the Senate is going to be a tougher discussion, and all of this goes against the timing, the fact that we are getting close to the end of the mandate for this parliament. But I hope we'll have this this bill passed by House of Representatives. I'm not a member of the Committee for Justice. One of the problems is that at the same time we're discussing about a bill on use soli and other very urgent issues. But anyway, I hope that at least in the lower house of our parliament, we can get this passed. I'm aware of the fact that my party is so timid in advocating this bill. And I'm sorry, I cannot be with you as an official representative of the Democratic Party. I very much like to say that cannabis legalization is one of the points on the agenda of my party. Unfortunately, that is not so. But again, I'm trying to be an optimist. As you said, every time we discuss about this within the Democratic Party, our voters, our volunteers, our activists are very much in favor of legalization. Let's say that they're a step forward, a step ahead of us. And in the long run, this is going to be turned into practice, to be put into practice. When the collection of signatures for the referendum started, the ease and willingness with which young voters signed was a sign to us. And so it was very obvious that our voters are in favor. And so I think that we should start from that, from the fact that our voters are one step ahead of our party establishment, of the leaders of the party. There have been campaigns within the party, and you've been very good at keeping hope alive, even at times when it was politically really very difficult to get these issues accepted. And so I'm confident that the difficulties can be overcome within the Democratic Party. I heard only the last few things that Maggie said. What I'd like to add is that I wouldn't want to start an electoral campaign with a political party that says that they're in favor of legalizing cannabis while they haven't done much when it was time to have a bill passed. So I'd like for my party to be credible, and in order to do that, we should pass this piece of legislation on, even if timid, even if moderate, about the legalization of cannabis. I think now is the time when we should show that we are in favor and we should invest some of our resources and energies into this. We'll do our best. We'll do our best in order to coordinate the party so that everyone is thinks along the same lines and on the same wavelength.
È una bella sfida.
Well, it's going to be a good,
it's
going to be a challenge. I'm glad that the voters are one step ahead of you. After all, it's better than them being one step behind you. I'd like to take advantage of the fact that we have Mr. Orfini with us. We try to get in touch with Mrs. Serracchiani, who's the head of the Democratic Party group. Would like to meet her in order to ask her for the Democratic Party to schedule the discussion of this bill of law in the House, because this usually makes it easier for and faster for the bill of law within the committee. So I'd like to ask Mr. Orfini to let Mrs. Serracchiani know that we like to do that. I think that's an acceptable request, and I promise I'll do it.
È già tanto. Grazie a Matteo Orfini e buon lavoro.
No, ti sei mutata, Antonella.
Mi sono mutata da sola e c'era fino a un minuto fa Eugenio Saitta, che però non vedo più.
Is Mr. Saitta with us?
Un appello a Eugenio Saitta.
Eccolo,
scusami. Ecco qui. Andiamo in Commissione Giustizia dal capogruppo del Movimento 5 Stelle, Eugenio Saitta. È una persona che ha fatto un grande lavoro sul disegno di legge di cui stiamo discutendo e per questo insomma lo ringraziamo e gli rompiamo anche a lui le scatole continuamente chiedendo a che punto è la situazione. La settimana prossima ce la facciamo di riprendere il dibattito.
Nagging him all the time and asking him, can you actually debate this issue next week? Well, hello Antonella, hello everyone. Well, the bill about home cultivation of cannabis is ready. Everything is ready. We have made the last little changes to the text. We have all the amendments ready. We had to start the discussion in Parliament, but we had to discuss the reform of the higher Council of Magistrates. We had very long meetings about it in the committee. The various groups, political groups have discussed it. And so this issue has overshadowed the bill on cannabis. Next week, we should complete the discussion about the reform of the Higher Council of Magistrates, and we should start discussing all the bills of law that have not been dealt with, including the cannabis bill. We will ask this bill on cannabis to be included in the agenda next week. So next week we should start working on this text.
Grazie mille all'onorevole Saitta, anche lui so che oggi aveva una giornata molto intensa ed è riuscito a collegarsi e per questo lo ringraziamo e sicuramente ci sentiremo nei prossimi giorni perché seguiremo la ripresa del dibattito. E buon lavoro a Eugenio Saitta e vedo che è riuscito a raggiungerci anche Matteo Mantero, senatore. Andiamo in un'area più difficile, il Senato, dove sicuramente c'è una maggioranza meno disponibile a questo tema, e quindi il lavoro è ancora più duro. Non so se Mantero mi sente, perché anche lui aveva delle difficoltà di collegamento. Eccolo qui, lo vediamo e forse lo sentiamo anche.
I have a very poor connection, unfortunately, so I will not use the video. I just want to say hello because I am recovering from a flu. I'm at home with my family, but I wanted to give you my greetings and thank you for what you do, for your battle to legalize cannabis. Yes, we've taken little steps, but even those little steps were brought about by you. So thank you very much for putting pressure on the members of parliament. Very rapidly, I like to say that this is a difficult time for our fight, because after the big enthusiasm of the collection of signatures for the referendum, there was a standstill. The fact that the Parliamentary Committee for Justice took up the topic again is a good sign, and I am reassured by what Saita said. The Democratic Party and the Five Stars movement, the more progressive political forces, should not postpone this debate, because this is the way to actually neglect the bill, let it fall, and then the parliamentary mandate will be over and the bill will not pass. So I believe that we have to ask politicians to take up their responsibility. Not only the Five Stars movement, the Democratic Party, but all the parties that in a short while will start their election campaign. They have to discuss this bill before the election campaign. So now they have a possibility to do it. Are they going to do it or not? If they don't do it, you are not allowed during the electoral campaign to talk about cannabis and say you're in favor of cannabis, because when you had a chance to vote an amendment and in a bill about cannabis, you didn't do it. So the voters of these parties in a large majority are in favor of cannabis. And the proof of that is that a large number of signatures were collected in a time span of a week. So I don't see how they can pretend that there's no issue there, there's no topic, and there's no reason to discuss the bill. And I will close here because my connection is not very good, and you probably heard also my
grazie a Matteo Mantero.
Thank you very much, Matteo.
Io la chiuderei qui, lasciando la parola al nostro chairman Marco Perduca e dicendo che siccome arrendersi purtroppo non è un'opzione, allora già dalla settimana prossima riprenderemo anche qualche manifestazione davanti alla Camera, ma abbiamo in programma un bel po' di iniziative. Sapete che parlarci ci piace, ma non esaurisce tutto quello che vorremmo fare, che tutto quello che facciamo lo facciamo per cambiare le leggi in questo paese. Quindi grazie a chi ci è da sponda e grazie anche a chi nonostante sia affaticato da da un Parlamento che certe volte è un po' un muro di gomma e dal dover rispondere a pregiudizi così incancreniti del resto se il nostro paese non fosse pervaso nelle istituzioni da grandi pregiudizi sulla droga e su chi la usa e su tutto ciò che ci sta intorno, non avremmo mai avuto casi come il caso Cookie che in questo giorno e che in questi giorni si è concluso dopo 13 anni di indagini, processi, 15 processi e quindi il filtro della riforma delle leggi sulle droghe ci serve anche per capire come funziona questo paese e quindi perché dobbiamo cambiarlo. Grazie a tutti gli ospiti di questo panel, la parola a Marco Perduca.
Our country. The floor to Marco Perduca. Thank you, Antonella. I would like to join all the thanks, first of all, for our interpreters, because they're shown more flexibility than the UN Convention, since they're still with us. They're doing some overtime. We'd like to thank the Radical Party, who has broadcast our meeting online. We've been meeting for about 3 hours now. We have 3 half-full glasses that we bring home. First of all, we've had a very lively chat. We never saw such a lively chat before. We're going to download it and we're going to read, because there's been really a parallel debate in writing on the chat. And maybe we could discuss again together, maybe on the eve of the International Day Against Drug Trafficking on the 26th of June, a day when a lot of us will present the next edition of the white paper on drugs in Italy. The second half-full glass is in terms of good intentions for the continent. During the first part of our afternoon, we have discussed European citizens' initiatives. We have to collect at least 1 million signatures in at least 7 member states to submit to the Commission and then to the European Parliament and European Council wants to submit a proposal to revise a European decision. And we are also collecting suggestions about this proposal. The third half-full glass is that we may challenge the decision of the Constitutional Court because, as Marco Cappato said, there's a material mistake by the judges of the Constitutional Court because they did not consider, while they were trying to mark all the mistakes of our text of referendum, well, they have neglected Law 390 because it was recently amended. And they have not considered all the subsequent changes that have been brought to that law, Law 390. If we had well read that law, he probably would have voted for a referendum in June. So we keep denouncing this decision that to reject our referendum. We are already organizing 2 seminars in order to prepare our challenge against the Constitutional Court, and then we will submit a document. that will come out of these two seminars. So thank you very much to all of you who have joined us this afternoon of 4:20, and now that we switch off, after we switch off our videos, we'll all celebrate this day. So have a good celebration.
Ciao.
Thank you to you all.